Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Metal Sanctuary. This time we're going to look at the top 10 records of 1983. But before we get into this list, first and foremost, yesterday we lost a very great voice in what I consider metal. I consider Chris Cornell to have been a metal singer. I believe that Soundgarden, at least up to the Super Unknown record, was a pretty metal band. Unfairly got lumped into a category of the Seattle area thing, grunge, alternative, whatever you want to call it. I think the musicianship in the band was a lot better than what the typical grunge or alternative bands had. I think that Chris, along with Lane Staley, were the two best vocalists out of that scene. And so, Soundgarden, a band very dear to me growing up in the 90s, but then even when I was in my own band, we tried to cover the song Outshine, and that's just one of the biggest vocal performances for him. So, tribute to Chris. We love you, we miss you, and see you on the other side, brother. Alright, let's go into the top 10, 1983. This is a big year because this is when, obviously this is when thrash is born. You get Metallica and you get Slayer and bands like Exciter, kind of building off what Anvil and Motorhead and Venom were doing before them. So that's when the thrash scene starts to explode with debut releases. Also, it's an interesting period in time because this is when the new wave of British heavy metal bands go into this like split faction. You have bands like Diamond Head and Def Leppard going into a little bit more of a commercial route. Then you have bands like Saxon and Maiden and Raven and so forth that kind of stick to what they were doing. So, and an interesting period also for, the heavy metal band that started everything, Black Sabbath. They go through another vocalist change. So a lot to really get into. Before I get into the list, I did have two honorable mentions that did not make this list. One of them being Grim Reaper's debut, See You in Hell, and Accept Balls to the Wall. Now, the reason why I didn't put Accept in this list like they were in the previous two is I just think, just overall looking at the other 10 records that I was able to put on here, I think they even though there's good songs on that record, I don't think they stood up to what these other records had to offer. So, let's dive in. At number 10, the debut from the band Savatage, Sirens. Savatage, a progressive / power metal band started by John Olivia out of Florida, and this is just like a couple years prior to what would eventually become a huge death metal scene. At number 9, the third solo record by Ozzy Osbourne, the first to feature Jake E. Lee on guitar, Bark at the Moon. At number 8, Motorhead comes back with Another Perfect Day. At number 7, the first release for Suicidal Tendencies, the self-titled record. This is where we talk about thrash being born. This is also kind of where a crossover kind of starts, right in the same time, because the thrash bands, while starting to release in 1983, had gotten started in like 81, and so Suicidal kind of in that frame, going more into a punk and a kind of groove area, but still having some thrash, be kind of starting crossover when thrash kind of starts. At number 6, Slayer, Show No Mercy, their debut. This is probably their most new wave of British heavy metal sounding record. I think their punk influence doesn't really come into what would be their third full-length record, Rain and Blood. So they've got a lot of Iron Maiden-esque riffs and kind of things going on that record. At number 5, another debut record, Exciter from Canada, Heavy Metal Maniac. Exciter's a band that can be sometimes classified as thrash, sometimes classified as speed metal. I think it just really depends on which record it is that they released. Number 4, dropping some spots down this time, is Iron Maiden with Peace of Mind. And this is where you get the introduction of Nico McBrain. You've got just excellent songs like Where Eagles Dare. Obviously, the songs like Revelations, Flight of Icarus, Still Life, Die With Your Boots On. Continues to more, I think, with the way that Nico plays drums, I think it influenced a lot of a different guitar rhythm thing going on. I think that they feel more like the first 2 records than they necessarily do Peace of Mind, sounding not as much like Number of the Beast. I think Number of the Beast started kind of being the more melodical stuff with Bruce Dickinson coming into the band. But I think Nico kind of helped. This is more of like a riff-driven record, and also the following record as well, Power Slave. At number 3, we bring into the fold the first Dio record. After leaving Sabbath after 1982, he forms his own band, Dio, with the record Holy Diver. That was my introduction to Ronnie James Dio. Songs like Invisible, Rainbow in the Dark, Holy Diver, obviously, very strong opening record. You've got a very underrated Vivian Campbell prior to going into Def Leppard being on this album. And that lineup he would have for 3 records, probably his best single era lineup total. At number 2, what I consider to be the probably proper thrash debut, because I think it sounded a little more thrashier than Exciter or Slayer, is Metallica's Kill 'Em All. I think they had a lot more punk kind of going on, and the riffs were really a lot more crunchier. They weren't necessarily feel like they were so clean necessarily. It could have been a production thing, but really in those times production was going to be an issue for metal anyway. At number 2, the second studio release, but first full-length record, number 1, is Merciful Fate's Melissa album. This is my favorite Merciful Fate record as well. I felt like they could have added the first EP to that record and had just probably one of the most classic records of all time, not just this year, but the production a little bit better than the EP. King Diamond's vocals getting a little bit more harnessed. Songs like Black Funeral, Into the Coven, the epic 11-minute Satan's Fall. A lot of the bands that came after them in the thrash era took a lot from Merciful Fate. Not just Metallica, who did a Merciful Fate medley, but also Slayer. If you listen to their second full-length record, Hell Awaits, there's a lot of progressive things going on that really key from Merciful Fate, and Kerry King has said in plenty of interviews that was a huge influence on them on this record. So there are my top 10 records from 1983. Stay metal, and God bless.